Hello, my name is Denise Harrington, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Williamsburg, Virginia, as well as a member of the State Board of the League of Women Voters of Virginia. Today, I'm going to narrate these slides pertaining to Juneteenth. The League of Women Voters of Williamsburg area is proud to partner with William and Mary to bring you this presentation on the story of Juneteenth, how it began, and what it means. Juneteenth is indeed a day of celebration as well as a day of remembrance, but it is also a day to dedicate ourselves to the struggle still to be won. The League of Women Voters is uniquely positioned to educate and to promote the principles embodied by Juneteenth. We celebrated the 100th anniversary of the founding of the National League of Women Voters and the State League of Virginia last year. The Williamsburg Area League began in 1962 during the Jim Crow era as the first integrated local league in Virginia. The 25 founding members of our local league had to persist for quite a while to be recognized as a league because 5 of them were Black. There are now more than 700 local and state leagues around the country, plus in DC, the US Virgin Islands, and Hong Kong. 14 other leagues are now in Virginia, and men have been members since 1974. Our nonpartisan mission is to encourage informed and active participation in government and to increase understanding of major public policy issues. Our website tells you more about the League and how to join us. What will we cover today? The major goal is to share America's enduring story about the struggle for freedom for Black people in our country. You will learn how Juneteenth evolved into a commemoration holiday, who celebrates it, and how it is celebrated. Might it ever become a national holiday? Finally, has the promise of America been fulfilled yet? Juneteenth is a combination of words, June and 19th. On that day in 1865, the enslaved Africans in Galveston, Texas, first heard from Union General Gordon Granger that the Civil War was over and that they had been freed. That was nearly 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and 2 months before Robert E. Lee surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse. The 13th Amendment that abolished slavery was already headed towards ratification too. So why was there still slavery in Texas? Robert E. Lee surrendered only his troops at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. That news spread slowly. So battles continued for weeks elsewhere, especially in remote states like Texas. In Galveston, Texas, before June 19th, there were only unconfirmed rumors. Before we talk about Juneteenth, we need to look at the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the top 10 most important documents in our country's history, as well as the most misunderstood. We will see it did not free all the enslaved Africans. Moreover, the document had little effect until after the war. However, what it did do was change the focus of the war from preserving the Union to abolishing slavery. Regrettably, Lincoln's freeing of the enslaved Africans was only on paper, and the ongoing Civil War prevented freedom from becoming a reality, as many plantation owners withheld the news. This is the famous painting of Lincoln reading his first draft of that famous document to his cabinet in July 1862. The history of the proclamation is a study in politics. In 1862, when Lincoln read that first draft, what else was happening in that July of 1862? The Union Army was losing the war, and Lincoln needed to cripple the cotton crop-based economy of the South. He was advised to delay the proclamation until after a Union military victory. A draw at Antietam was sufficient. Only then did Lincoln sign the preliminary proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. That preliminary document called on all Confederate states to rejoin the Union within 100 days by January 1st, 1863, or the enslaved Africans in those states would be declared, quote, thenceforward and forever free. But can you read between the lines here? This initial proclamation applied only to the states that had seceded from the Union, not to the four loyal to the Union states, Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, where slavery still flourished. Lincoln had supported colonization of the enslaved Africans back to Africa at this time, but that idea, thankfully, did not make it into the proclamation. Neither did the concept of reparation, something we are still grappling with in headlines today. It stands in contrast to the Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862, which freed all enslaved Africans in Washington, D.C., compensated slaveholders, and gave freed men and women money to immigrate, a variation of Lincoln's colonization idea. When the Confederacy had not yielded by the deadline in Lincoln's initial proclamation, he issued the final Emancipation Proclamation after a traditional New Year's Day reception at the White House. The final proclamation echoed the language preliminary. Lincoln went upstairs to his study for the signing in the presence of a few friends. No cabinet meeting was called, and no attempt was made to have a ceremony. As he took up the pen to sign the paper, his hand shook so violently that he could not write. He said, I could not for a moment control my arm. I paused, and a superstitious feeling came over me, which made me hesitate. In a moment, I remembered that I had been shaking hands for hours with several hundred people, and hence a very simple explanation of the trembling and shaking of my arm. Lincoln said, quote, I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. About 8 p.m., the transmission of the text over the telegraph wires began, but the news was exceedingly slow and reaching remote areas. It never reached the enslaved Africans of Texas. On that January 1, 1863, First Night Watch, or Freedom's Eve, services occurred in many Black communities as enslaved and free African Americans gathered in churches and private homes all across the country, but not in Texas, awaiting news that the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect. But we can only wonder how the enslaved Africans in the border states received the news. Unless they had been voluntarily freed by their owners, enslaved Africans in those states had to wait until passage of the 13th Amendment to be free. Many decorative versions of the Emancipation Proclamation were produced, but this was not the age of the internet or CNN, and news traveled slowly. Today, there remain varying accounts of why it took so long for the news of slavery's abolition to reach Texas, with one story claiming that a messenger bearing the news was murdered on his way there. However, historians also report that many slave owners in Texas intentionally withheld information about the Emancipation Proclamation from enslaved Africans before 1865 in order to keep their labor force intact. Even after learning of their freedom, many enslaved Africans stayed on the plantations and became sharecroppers because they had nowhere else to go. Technically, they were free, but in fact, they were in economic bondage to their former owners. Yet still, on that day in June, there was celebrating, singing, and prayer among the more than 250,000 newly freed enslaved Africans in Texas. One year later, the first commemorative celebration of Juneteenth took place in Texas. Over subsequent years, former enslaved Africans and their families continued celebrating their freedom with annual Juneteenth celebrations that featured former enslaved Africans delivering inspirational speeches and readings of the Emancipation Proclamation, along with rodeos and hog roast. Thus, the tradition of Juneteenth family barbecues in Texas began. Celebrations spread across the state. Today, a mural in Galveston marks the spot where General Granger issued the order. But how has widespread celebration of Juneteenth evolved? How has Juneteenth evolved? One of the earliest official commemorations of Juneteenth may have been in Houston since 1872. Thousands in Houston have celebrated Juneteenth at Emancipation Park with a mix of religious services, storytelling, music, food, and parades. The first few decades after the enslaved Africans in Texas were officially freed, Juneteenth was primarily celebrated by the descendants of those enslaved Africans. But word of the holiday spread first throughout the South and then to the rest of the states as the freed people migrated to different parts of the country as part of the Great Migration. One person, one carload, or one train ticket at a time. In present day America, while still not recognized as a federal holiday, Juneteenth is celebrated in Black communities as a way to acknowledge the freedoms earned in the past, as well as the continued need for advancement toward a better future. Since 1872, Thousands in Houston have celebrated Juneteenth at Emancipation Park with a mix of religious service storytelling again, music, food, and parades. Here is one of the earliest photos of a Juneteenth celebration in Austin, Texas in 1900. Already, the idea of Juneteenth as a day of festivity had taken root. While commemoration of Juneteenth spread steadily throughout the country, commemorating it spread to neighboring states and eventually to California as Black Texans moved west. It declined, however, during World War II in the 1940s in the face of new segregation laws and brutal lynchings that disconnected more Blacks from their history. Juneteenth was revived in the early 50s, yet declined again during the civil rights era of the late 50s and 1960s, then picked up in the 1970s. Texas was the first to make it a state holiday in 1979. There is a Juneteenth flag that resembles the Texas state flag with a red and blue background. It features a 12-pointed bursting star with a white 5-pointed star inside it that represents a new freedom, a new people, a new star. Although it has been long celebrated in the African American community, this monumental event remains largely unknown to most other Americans and was poorly understood until very recently outside the Black community. There is also a pervasive idea, itself a legacy of Jim Crow, that Juneteenth is a Black thing, much like Kwanzaa. However, since the killing of George Floyd and the summer 2020 protests, more and more Americans have come to realize that it is something for all Americans of every race to celebrate. Commemorating Juneteenth obviously will not end racism, but it can foster dialogue about the trauma that has resulted from slavery and the doctrine of white supremacy. It can also help solidify the concepts embodied in the finest words of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that we are all created equal, that we are all one people, that we are all Americans together. How is Juneteenth celebrated now? The scholar Henry Louis Gates captures it well. He describes Juneteenth as evolving over generations to become an occasion for gathering lost family members, measuring progress against freedom, and celebrating rising generations with the values of self-improvement and racial uplift. Religious sermons, traditional music, and the almighty barbecue pit at the center. Red foods are popular at Juneteenth celebrations. In some West African cultures, the color red signifies strength and a resilience in the face of bondage. Red drinks have links to the fruits of two native West African plants, the kola nut and the hibiscus. When crushed into a powder, then added into water, the kola nut creates a reddish-brown, refreshing drink. By the 1920s, red-colored carbonated drinks like the Texas-made soda Big Red became part of the Juneteenth culinary tradition. But let's leave modern times to revisit the country in the aftermath of the Civil War. While enslaved Africans may have been freed, their world was not safe. Blacks needed strength in the post-Civil War years. After Rutherford B. Hayes became president in 1876, Black Southerners were disenfranchised, and a stage was set for a systematic entrenchment of white supremacy norms. In 1890, Mississippians drafted a white supremacist state constitution designed to disenfranchise Mississippi blacks, included provisions that required people to be able to read, and formally it was against the law to teach an enslaved African to read and write, and understand all parts of the state constitution in order to vote. Jim Crow laws passed in more southern states, and the Ku Klux Klan rose to prominence, along with domestic terrorism and lynchings. All of this activity occurred despite the 3 Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, which were designed to entrench the rights of freed enslaved Africans as full American citizens, formerly enslaved Africans. But the amendments were incomplete and flawed, which allowed the former slave states to start chipping away at the rights those amendments supposedly granted. One misconception about Juneteenth is that it was the day slavery ended. As much as Juneteenth represents freedom, it represents how emancipation was tragically delayed for formerly enslaved people in the deepest trenches of the Confederacy. Slavery only ended legally after the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865, and it had a major loophole. The amendment freed all enslaved Africans with this language. Quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. 9 states use that phrase, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, to develop up and convict leasing convicts, a system that leased convicts that began with the Civil War and continued until the 1940s. A theft of $10 was grand larceny, vagrancy was a crime, and once convicted, felons could not vote. So, the Jim Crow laws of Reconstruction continued. The practice of denying the right to vote to ex-felons continues today in many states. 3 years later, the 14th Amendment guaranteed all persons born within the United States the right to citizenship, regardless of their status as former slaves, and gave the federal government the right to punish any state that abridged its citizens' rights. It would become the foundation for many civil rights lawsuits in modern times. 6 years later, the 15th Amendment, the last of the so-called Reconstruction amendments, granted Black men the right to vote. Along with the 13th and 14th Amendments, the 15th was designed to establish political equality for all Americans. But what was the reality? Convicted felons could still not vote, and Jim Crow laws and other discriminatory practices like literacy tests and poll tax, especially in the South, kept Blacks away from the polls for many more decades. The reality was that the Jim Crow era existed for about 100 years after the Civil War ended. Jim Crow was not a real person, but a contemptuous term for a Black man based on a minstrel show character and meant to marginalize Blacks. The so-called Black Codes worked in conjunction with labor camps for the incarcerated, where prisoners were treated as enslaved people. Black offenders typically received longer sentences than their white equals, and because of the grueling work, often did not live out their entire sentence. The Ku Klux Klan, that began at this time in 1865 in Tennessee, was continually active during these white supremacy years. Lynchings took place, both in public and in secret. In many places, they were seen as spectator events, and with the public frequently viewing them. Whites-only signs prevailed. Jim Crow laws defined the second-class treatment lives that Blacks had to endure. These laws would live on for 100 years after the Civil War, with segregated facilities primarily in the former Confederate states, schools, waiting rooms, in bus and train stations, hospitals, water fountains, restrooms, building entrances, elevators, cemeteries, even amusement park cashiers. Payment of a poll tax was a prerequisite to vote in a number of states, including Virginia, until 1965. Poll tax of the time may not seem expensive at first look. In Texas, the initial cost was $1.50, or about $40 today. But in an economic system designed to keep non-white incomes well below average, these relatively modest fees were enough to shut many minority voters out, not to mention lower income whites completely out of the voting system. Decades after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were passed into law, African Americans still faced disproportionate inequality when it came to voting in the United States. The conditions that existed during slavery were mirrored by Jim Crow laws in the South until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 put an end to literacy tests, poll tax, and other voter suppression tactics. It expanded the 14th and 15th Amendments by banning the racial discrimination in voting practices that had existed for nearly a century. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided for federal approval or pre-clearance of proposed changes to voting laws in many southern states, Virginia included, that had previously used tests to determine voter eligibility. That remedy, however, was not to last. In 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby County v. Holder struck down the pre-clearance requirement as unconstitutional, stating that those circumstances of discrimination no longer existed and that pre-clearance penalized southern states. Hundreds of new state laws were immediately introduced to make voting more difficult, and voter suppression remains in the news today. Despite the shamefully incomplete and inadequate road to true equality for African Americans, Juneteenth remains the hallmark for the beginning of freedom. Over time, Juneteenth has been called Emancipation Day, Jubilee Day, Juneteenth National Freedom Day, Juneteenth Independence Day, and Black Independence Day. Despite its symbolic importance, the day has faced competition from other emancipation holidays and was unknown to many Americans until recent years. Juneteenth has long been overshadowed by July 4th. Some are ambivalent about the recent prominence of Juneteenth. Though not a federal holiday, 47 states and DC have all passed legislation recognizing Juneteenth as either a state holiday or a day of observance. Hawaii, North Dakota, and South Dakota are the only states that do not recognize the holiday. Some people have mixed feelings about companies such as Google, Twitter, and Nike making Juneteenth a company-recognized holiday, yet many others publicly lobby for Juneteenth to become a national holiday. "97-year-old Opal Lee is one of the most visible proponents for Juneteenth to be a federal holiday. Her walk from Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C., inspired millions of Americans to sign her petition on change.org. She was recently recognized as an honoree of the International Peace Honors for being a voice of peace for her activism and support for Juneteenth. A national holiday commemorating Juneteenth would spur not only conversation about the origins of our current racial and political conflicts, but would also prompt vitally necessary education about white supremacy and its manifestations in policies and political actions, such as laws making voting more difficult. Currently, voter mobilization nonprofit Next Gen America is circulating an online petition calling on Congress to recognize Juneteenth as a national holiday. In 2020, Pharrell Williams joined Governor Northam in Virginia and announcing that Juneteenth would now be a paid state holiday, but COVID precautions made celebrating the day last year exceedingly difficult. As Americans shed light on the injustices the Black community has endured due to racism, Juneteenth becomes a major part of the conversation. But we have to be careful that the revitalized interest in African American history and culture and the warp speed in which Juneteenth discussions are happening does not commercialize the holiday, lessening the meaning and impact of this significant date for the Black community and, indeed, for all of the United States as Americans. As Americans debate whether Juneteenth should be celebrated as a leisure holiday, a national holiday, or a day of reflection and service, the happy medium might be a little bit of both. There is no specific way of celebrating Juneteenth. In certain regions in the northern U.S., such as New England, people may focus their celebrations on oratory or prayer, while in other regions, like Texas and Louisiana, watch out. Family cookouts and barbecues may be the form of celebration that takes place. For those who wish to celebrate Juneteenth this year and many years ahead, here are ways to ensure the day doesn't become commercialized and remains meaningful. Learn something new about Black culture and African American history. Register voters. Support Black-owned businesses. The recent book, On Juneteenth, is a sweeping story of Juneteenth's integral importance to American society, as told by a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and Texas native, Annette Gordon Reed. It is a stark reminder that the fight for equality is ongoing. When all is said and done, the beautiful legacy of Juneteenth is what it can do for our future as a country and as one American family. By looking back, looking around, and looking within, we are challenged to evaluate the foundations of inequality and move forward together, committing ourselves to the unfinished work of eradicating all forms of racism. Voting remains key to finally realizing the promise of Juneteenth. Why have Blacks struggled so long and so hard to obtain the right to vote? Why have so many people fought and are still fighting to keep some Americans from voting or to make it difficult? Because every vote is important. Voting is the cornerstone of American independence and American freedom. Voting is the true equalizer. And to that point, we ask the question, has the promise of America been fulfilled yet? This video from one of the League of Women Voters' national partners captures the answer.
They tried to silence me.
They tried to block me. They tried to deny me.
To scare me.
To scare me. They tried to erase me.
They tried to keep me down. Keep me down.
They tried to make me invisible. They tried to pretend I don't matter.
Pretend my people don't matter.
My people don't matter.
They tried to kill me.
Kill me. Kill me. They tried to suppress me. Suppress me. They tried to block me. They tried to suppress me. They tried to deny me.
And still.
And still. And still.
And still, I vote.
I vote. Todavía voy a votar. And still.
I vote.
I vote.
And still I vote.
And still I vote.
Let's never forget that we are all part of the American family. The history of one of us is the history of all of us. We rise together. Happy Juneteenth, everybody. Bye-bye.